Welcome to Babblecom 5.
This is episode 12 of season 2 of Babylon 5 Acts of Sacrifice. The episode opens on debris from ongoing space combat between Narn and Centauri forces. A lone Jaquan cruiser with some remaining Narn fighters is trying to hold its own against 3 Centauri cruisers, but is getting a pasting. It opens a jump point to try and withdraw, but then hears that a civilian transport with 700 women and children on board is a straggler and coming into the combat zone. In a noble move, the Narn captain orders his navigation officer to hold the jump point open, but put their cruiser between the transport and the Centauri cruisers. This allows the transport to use the jump point to get clear, but the Centauri focus their fire on the already damaged Narn cruiser and take it out. The footage cuts off, and we see Jakar pacing the briefing room with the senior staff. 5,000 Narn were lost in the battle, which Jakar claims was an unjustified assault by the Centauri because they had said they wouldn't attack civilian outposts. Londo is not present to give a rebuttal, but the Centauri claim that both the colony and the escaping transport held military assets, making them valid targets. Sheridan acknowledges that the first casualty of war is the truth, but can't really offer Jakar any firmer support than he'll speak to EarthGov. Meanwhile, a new race is visiting the station, and Sheridan is delegating the task of handling the Lumati to Ivanova, part of her diplomacy training. Jakar is now petitioning Delenn to bring Minbar on side, but she sees it as a cyclical problem. Once they intervene, the Centauri stop, but the Narn build back to full strength, and then the Centauri ask for help. Jakar acknowledges that his previous attitude towards the Centauri do not incline right-minded governments to come to his aid now, but says that all his people had left to drive them was revenge, having been trodden under the wheel for so long by the Centauri. Delenn notes that she was there when the Minbari first encountered Earthships who attacked out of fear, killing the Minbari's leader and driving their near-genocidal campaign for revenge against the humans. She says her people do not have any taste for further conflict at this point. She says the council can mediate, but for Jakar, there is no middle ground. The Lumati come on board, and to Ivanova's immediate bemusement, only one of them speaks for the other. Until they are deemed worthy, the servitor will speak on their representative's behalf. Effectively, they are here to evaluate whether Babylon 5 is worthy to be graced by their awesome presence. So begins the tour. In a bar, Centauri stir up trouble with 2 Narn until Zack intervenes with the security squad. Tensions are clearly mounting. In Londo's quarters, he finds that his newfound respect has in fact turned him into a wishing well with legs, as the businessman asks for favours in return for certain gifts. He has Veer send the other applicants away for the day. In a corridor, the Centauri from the bar engage the Narn with a 2-to-1 advantage. One Narn is knocked down, but as Zack arrives again, he wields a metal bar and tries to get to the Centauri Zack is holding, despite having been told to stand down. He's taken down by a PPG shot from Zack at close range and killed. The Centauri runs off as Zack checks the Narn. Sheridan and Jakar are at loggerheads, arguing over who started what and the right to self-defense. Sheridan is less than impressed, questioning Jakar's ability to control his people, and infuriated that Babylon 5, supposedly neutral, is being turned into a war zone when he's trying to help Jakar. He demands Jakar get his people in line, and is giving the same message to Londo, otherwise they won't be welcome on the station. Franklin is giving a rundown on how the Isolab works in Medlab when the Lumati arrive there. They have rather divergent views on treating members of other races. In fact, the Lumati would neither hurt nor help an inferior species, because to do so would get in the way of evolution and natural selection. Franklin sees no one as inferior to anyone else, which they identify as a common belief amongst inferior species. Ivanova rolls her eyes and mouths "I'm sorry" at Franklin as the tour moves on. Londo is repaying Garibaldi for his past loans now that he has good fortune, but really he is seeking some form of companionship that doesn't come with a wish list. He acknowledges that Garibaldi has always been there for him without ulterior motives, and now that things have changed, he recognises the value in their relationship. Yet Garibaldi says he doesn't know him anymore, that he and the others are even afraid of him. The casino behind him is full of life, yet Londo feels very isolated, and hopes that Garibaldi will join him for a chemically inoffensive drink later in the evening. G'Kar is trying to explain to the local Narn that pushing the Centauri off their homeworld through a war of attrition was one thing. Engaging them in full-scale open warfare is something else again, and they need the alliances the station gives them the opportunity to create. So he urges them to remain calm, saying that he has been fighting for their freedom all his life, but now is not the time for fighting or displays of supposed strength. Incredible number of Narn prosthetics in this one scene. Unfortunately, whilst the local Narn spokesperson acknowledges G'Kar's words, it seems obedience is something they struggle with. The Centauri, who was the ringleader from the brawl earlier, is brought out gagged as G'Kar leaves, then stabbed by the spokesperson, who orders him left where he can be found. In 6 hours they intend to do the same to every Centauri on the station. Now it's CSI B5. The Centauri's autopsy obviously tells us what we already know, but there's nothing to pin the death conclusively on the Narn. They all know it's extremely likely that it was the Narn, of course, but Sheridan asks Garibaldi to keep a lid on it, because it'll be the spark that sets the whole powder keg off. Londo has been left alone in the bar as it closes. The Lumati decide to change the rules of engagement and arrive unannounced at Ivanova's quarters, where the representative shows an interest in her nightwear. He feels she might be showing them only the best elements of the station, which is understandable, but Ivanova says she'll show them whatever they want to see. Meanwhile, the local Narn are procuring nasty poison-tipped long knives, but Natoth has her eyes on them and reports him to G'Kar. He says he's got to deal with it personally at its source to stop the planned attack. He needs to re-establish his authority. Natoth is going to have his back. Sheridan's attempt to bring Eartha in to protect Narn civilians has fallen on deaf ears, but he puts in a call to Delenn. The Lumati have inevitably picked down below as the place to be shown to them by Ivanova, yet it doesn't go as she might have expected. They see it as a clever way to prevent inferior humans from having opportunities to procreate, whilst providing a source of cheap manual labour with no power base, all within their own species, which they find admirable. Ivanova thinks better of trying to explain that it isn't part of some grand plan, but just dumb luck, and finally the senior representative starts talking to her directly. They're even going to implement this intra-species improvement approach themselves, apparently. G'Kar takes back his authority through a direct physical challenge. Natoth intervenes as one of the spectators charges a weapon, but G'Kar is able to overcome the challenger despite him pulling a knife on him. G'Kar disbands the gathering, but is struck from behind by the challenger as he is leaving, getting poisoned by the Drazi blade in the process. He tells Natoth he mustn't show weakness, and she supports him, apt to leave the room. Sheridan is hatching a very unofficial plan with Delenn to get excess food from Babylon 5 to Narn civilians. Once empty, those Minbari transports can then be used to bring Narn civilians into safety, because the Centauri won't interfere with Minbari ships. Franklin's contacts from the Underground Telepath Railroad will also help. Both agree that as their governments are unable to act, it falls to them to do what they can. Delenn is in agreement, but does note that she now has less influence than she used to have, following the events of All Alone in the Night, of course. In Sheridan's office, Ivanova is keen to seal a deal with the Lumati, and so too is their representative, although perhaps more literally than she'd anticipated. The Lumati celebrate unions of the mind with unions of the body. He wants to have sex with Ivanova. Thinking on her feet, she fakes a call from CNC for another meeting and legs it. Meanwhile, Natoth has the murderer gift-wrapped for Sheridan and Garibaldi. He'll confess to everything. Garibaldi does a good Londo impression when imagining the sort of mileage Londo will get from a Narn having killed a Centauri on the station. It's ugly, and of course Ivanova has problems of her own. She's discussing it with Franklin, who offers to drug her to take the edge off when she has a brainwave. G'Kar is feeling the worse for wear, but has treated the wound and the poison. Natoth brings word that Delenn and Sheridan want to meet with him, and his spirits are buoyed, because there isn't what he was hoping for, at all. He can't even talk about it, otherwise the aid will vanish, as it's all under the radar. He half laughs, half sobs, through his pain, as he heads back to his quarters. In Ivanova's quarters, she's hatching her cunning plan. Realising that the Lumati probably don't know what human sex involves, she manoeuvres him to doing it her way rather than his, and proceeds to do a hilarious routine involving dancing around him while fast-forwarding through a typical human dating ritual, including a faked orgasm, all with clothing remaining firmly on. You really need to see it to appreciate it. The really funny thing is that his servitor takes her hand and kisses it before he leaves, implying he knew that his boss had been massively had, but of course only inferior species suffer from ignorance. Sheridan and Garibaldi manage to sweet-talk Londo into not demanding that the Narn be tried on the station. Despite being stood up by Garibaldi, he is quite amenable to this, having identified the dead Centauri as a known troublemaker with no family back home to fight his corner. He will simply require that the Narn be deported, his personal effects sold, and the proceeds given to the Centauri War Fund. He says that irony will be sufficient compensation. Ivanova receives a gift from the departing Lumati representative via Sheridan, some sort of cap with bells on, and a promise that next time they'll do it his way, whatever that might be. Londo and Garibaldi do finally have a drink together, acknowledging their friendship, even if circumstances are going to make it short-term in nature, perhaps. I've always remembered the opening sequence of this episode, in part because it's a nice demonstration of B5 space combat, but primarily because it shows just how far the Narn are willing to go to save one another. It is, of course, an act of sacrifice, because the Narn captain knows damn well that in forming a physical shield for the transport to get into hyperspace, he's dooming his own ship and crew to be taken down by concentrated fire from the Centauri. Strategically, this is a horrible decision, because ultimately they need the warship, but morally it's the heroic thing to do. That sets the tone for this episode. The Narn are on the defensive, G'Kar casting about for support wherever he can find it, and tragically finding that his posturing to this point in the story has made it very difficult to secure allies. As we've learned from recent experience, the line about the first casualty in war being the truth is very valid, and Londo doesn't even bother turning up to try and argue his government's point. G'Kar has to take a poisoned knife in the back to hold his own people back, and in spite of that sacrifice, he can only hope to save some lives, not to turn the tide of the war. And as he tells the local Narn spokesperson, his people are just not used to war. They want their homeworld back, not by a military campaign, but by wearing the Centauri down. They have weapons now, but they don't have practice in using them, and their aggressive posturing means nothing to a Centauri iron cannon. They even fight amongst themselves. So yes, G'Kar will sacrifice his dignity and go cap in hand to the other races because he can see the writing on the wall. Switch to Londo, and he's in the ascendance, barely even concerned with the war, and instead pondering whether he has sacrificed what should be worthwhile in order to elevate his political standing. He is absolutely desperate to identify Garibaldi as his friend, to latch onto him as everyone else seeks to curry favour with him, and yet Garibaldi is clearly seriously reassessing what had to this point been quite an entertaining relationship between the two of them. Like G'Kar, Londo has brought this changed circumstance down on his own head. In amongst these themes, we see both ambassadors leaning on their A's as they struggle, not so different. We hear Delenn recount the terrible path that revenge can lead down, and an outline of the events that began the Earth-Minbari War. We see an unlikely alliance arise between Sheridan and Delenn as they use their unofficial channels to try and support the Narn. And lest we forget, the rather interesting Lumati, I imagine derived from Illuminati, the enlightened ones. Obviously their philosophy is intentionally at odds with the mindset of someone like Franklin, but it's also calling out the fact that our class structure, even in the future, does have societal consequences that benefit those who have managed to do better than others for whatever reason. Again, not necessarily evolutionary forces at work, but the Lumati equate the two, and fortunately for Ivanova, that gives her the outcome everyone wanted, even if it does require her to boldly go where no human has been before. I still struggle a little with the new Natoth actress, although I think she does play her relationship with G'Kar better in this episode than she has done previously. She just doesn't have quite the same presence for my money, but anyway. Although the war has been going on for a few weeks, this is the first time we've seen it focused on, and what that really means for the shifting dynamics within Babylon 5's council, together with Delenn and Sheridan's own shifts in circumstances. Londo and G'Kar have now effectively swapped trajectories, where once G'Kar thought they might even work together against the ancient enemy, and that the Emperor was not who he thought he was, he now trudges downhill from that prospect, while Londo climbs the hill, but with much baggage. Where their paths will go from here remains to be seen. I'll catch up with you for the next episode. Bye for now.